building a lean, mean Drupal theme. As you can see, I've already presented a few times, and I'm presenting it again in Chattanooga in a couple weeks. So if you want more goodness, you can come to that camp. I'm Jim Smith. I have been doing Drupal for quite a long time, but I've only been doing it full-time for about 2 years. I work for a company called DS Federal. It's a company based in Rockville, Maryland. I live in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and I get the nice opportunity to work from home, of course. So I work primarily on a website called healthit.gov. That's a federal website, part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And no, it's not that health website. So again, there's the page if you wanted to either get a PDF or the full presentation. So when we talk about, oh, by the way, last time I did this presentation, about 2/3 of the room didn't know what I was talking about or didn't recognize the. If you don't recognize the reference, it's from the movie Stripes. That's John Candy. And he made he said he was a lean, mean fighting machine. So anyway, that's the reference. So what we're talking about is making our sites as performant as possible from the front end. But why do we want to do that? Well, I mean, it seems like kind of obvious. Why don't you want to be fast? But let's take a look at specifically why we want to be fast with our website. We want it because we know that users are impatient. They're not going to wait around to get the information if they can get it elsewhere. And when they are happy, they're going to spend more time on your site, and that's never a bad thing, especially if they're going to be buying something. If you're trying to either sell a product or you're at least trying to get them convinced to a point of view or perhaps contribute as a donation or what have you. And the other thing, though, is that from your standpoint, when you're delivering less bandwidth out of your site, then you don't have to push out as much through your server, and therefore, theoretically, it's cheaper for you. And the other thing, as a developer, the code is just easier to maintain if it's clean and easy to read and easy for the browser to load. So to consider what makes a website fast, we talk primarily about the weight of that page. And so there was a study that's done about every year by this website called websiteoptimization.com. They haven't updated for this year, but they said the average site of a website is more than 1,600 K. That's all the files, the assets that go into making that page. That's just one page, mind you, and we're taking just the top 1,000 websites when we consider that. They also look at the number of objects. Those are the assets. Those are the files that each page has to call to load. And there are, on average, 112 objects. We know over time that number of objects and page weight has gone up. And it's gone up, obviously, because we have more bandwidth to give. Back when the old days of the 9600 baud dial-up modems, we didn't have the ability to push a lot of content, so we tried. The pages were obviously lean then. We kind of have gotten a little bit lazy and happy with that bandwidth, though, and so we tend to take advantage of it. And so that's not a good thing. This tweet by Michael Godbout a few months ago kind of hits upon the idea quite well. You can tell from the previous example the average and how far off the average this particular site is, and then consider what if you were on a mobile phone with 3G service, how long would it take to load a page? So the point being is just because we have bandwidth doesn't mean we should to abuse it. So to hit that point even further, let's say we have a commerce site where we are wanting to sell something. Well, your conversion is going to drop by 7% just by delaying 1 second, and the number of page views is going to drop by 11%, and the customer satisfaction drop by 16%. That's just for 1 second difference between your site and another site that maybe is 1 second faster. So O'Reilly Radar looked at just the difference that it makes to optimize images on a site, and they found they specifically looked at Etsy and found that by adding their image weight of a page by 160K, they increased their bounce rate by 12%. So that's a fairly significant amount of change in your traffic based on just a unoptimized image, for example. So the point here is don't be slow. That's fairly obvious, but how do we get faster? Well, I'm going to get into that, but before I do, let's take a look at some assumptions that we should make first. First of all, we want to make sure that we want to understand that every site has different requirements. So there's no cookie cutter method to this. Your decisions are going to have to be based on the content and the type of site that you're building. And the other assumption that we need to make is that the things that you leave out are the things that are going to make your site faster. If you can leave something out, that alone will help you. The other thing to understand here is that different browsers are going to affect performance differently because of their ability to handle the number of assets and the number of host names and the number of connections per browser. So this is a point that is hard for you to maybe be that specific in terms of your judgment, but it's good to at least understand that different browsers handle the number of connections differently. There's a 20% rule that's a good thing to follow and to understand. That's the fact that if you make a change on the performance of your site that is less than a 20% improvement over what it was before, or a 20% improvement over a competitor's site, nobody's going to notice it. So you need to be at least 20% faster than what you were before your audience is going to tell that there's a difference. The other thing to keep in mind here, like the 20% rule, is the golden rule, where 80 to 90% of your end user response time is spent on the front end. In other words, you can tune your server, you can make all the performance changes that you can on the back end, but they will not make anywhere near the difference of the front end. This is an example of a site, if I remember right, it's LinkedIn, where you can see where the amount of time spent loading the site is shown in this graph with different assets being loaded at different points. The back end is just that front part, and everything else is after the front end starts working or starts loading. We define the back end as being the time it takes for the first byte to be delivered to the browser. And then after that, everything else is the front end. So now let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of making your site faster. We're going to talk about that in 6 different ways. The first is cache everything you can. Secondly, clean up Drupal's cruft. And believe it or not, there is some cruft in Drupal. Clean up your code. So not just what Drupal delivers out of core or out of the modules, but the code that you contribute to it. Concatenate and minify anything that you can. Deliver your assets efficiently, and set performance budgets to test against. And this is a key one that we'll dig into a little bit at the end. So one final point is that some of the information here is going to be made obsolete by either Drupal 8 or the HTTP2 protocol. So not every browser is following HTTP2 yet. It's right now, a lot of them are still on 1.1. But some of the things like the number of concurrent connections that can be made at a given time are affected by this. But nonetheless, even though some of the information may be made obsolete, that doesn't negate the fact that we still want to make our sites as lean and mean as possible. So let's talk about caching. As Jeff Eaton says, why repeat something when you can cache it and reuse it? So we're going to cache everything you can by turning on page and block caching, which is part of core, and you're probably already doing that, but it's a good thing to remind. Turn on views caching. One thing that you may not know is that if you turned on block caching, that does not include automatically the caching that's done by blocks that are created in views. So you want to, for each view that you create, you want to make sure that you are tuning the cache that's appropriate to that. Now there are some times when caching blocks or other content in views is not a good thing because it's dynamic. Every time you create a new node, for example, that's being called by a view, you want to make sure that once you've created that node that it appears in the view. So there is a module that's called the Views Content Cache module. This is a Drupal 7 module that will allow you to tweak that even further, and that's a handy thing to have. Smaller sites can use a module called Boost. It's not going to be much value to a large enterprise site, but let's say you're on a shared hosting plan or something like that. Boost will allow you to do some of the things that bigger sites are doing without, at least in a sense, by caching the full page HTML. There are some things that are outside of the realm of Drupal that you can also do, primarily making sure that if you can, using memcache or varnish, and if you are on Acquia or Pantheon or a larger service such as that, chances are you have access to that, and you should take advantage of it because that's the best way to cache your site. The next thing that we're going to talk about is cleaning up Drupal's cruft. One thing that we can do is turn off the update module in production. It's fine for checking your site to make sure that your modules are up to date and all that kind of thing on your local site or a dev site, but when you get to production, turn it off. It's not needed. What it does is it checks in with Drupal.org to see if a module's been changed, but you shouldn't be dealing with that in production. Don't bother with the statistics module. Chances are you're using already a Google Analytics or some other analytics service, and so the statistics module, unless there's a specific reason for it, like you want to display the number of visits to a specific page or something like that for the public to see, you're not going to need the statistics module. There is a module called the FAST 404 that is handy for making the delivery of 404 pages faster, just like it says. What some people don't realize is that every time there is an asset missing from a page, there's a chance it's going to call up a 404, and that's running the full bootstrap of Drupal in order to deliver that page. So using this module circumvents that. And sometimes we get into bad habits where we'll turn on a module, we'll test it out, and then we say, no, that's not really what I thought it was, and we forget to turn it off. Maybe we turn it off, but we still leave it in the system. Just remove it. If you don't need it, don't leave it in. And this goes back to one of the things I said before, was that the best thing that you can do is to not install something to begin with, or not use something to begin with. So if you can avoid installing a module, don't. Code is something that we take for granted sometimes, because we think that the people who developed our modules are being efficient, and so we don't pay that much attention sometimes to the markup. But this is an example from that Mario Hernandez did in a blog post where he took a look at a panels page, and this is a real example where all these divs are going basically to display this link. Now, there are some other panes in this page that are also nested. You can kind of tell by the different rows, but this is just one. Primarily, that's just one row and one div that's needed, but all these others are just serving as wrappers. It's just what's the word? Yeah. It's silly. So clean up your code by following Drupal's best practices for themes. If you understand the theme system, you will really help yourself a lot. The Drupal's theme system has methods for calling up template files. It has methods for overwriting files, or using preprocessed functions, etc. If you understand all of those, you will help yourself a lot just in making your site efficient. If you are looking for using a base theme, find one that has as few number of unnecessary nested divs as possible. A couple that come to mind are Zen and Aurora. I'm not sure about Omega. I know that that the Omega has changed over the years, and I remember back in the days when you used to use a lot of back-end configuration to set up that particular theme, and those things are convenient. They're really good for back-end developers who don't understand theming, but they are really bad on performance. Oops. If you can, the best way to go is to create a custom theme template files, or a custom theme altogether, because they allow you to remove the unnecessary stuff. And this goes back, though, to understanding Drupal's theme best practices and understanding how the whole theme system works. There is also a module called Fences that it goes back to adding a module that maybe you don't need, but if you are looking, especially if you're a backend person that isn't quite sure about some of this stuff, the Fences module will at least help you in some respects, because it will allow you to specify using an H2 tag instead of a div, or things like that. So and there's reasons why you would want to do that. Divs are probably about the least specific thing that you can do in your theme files. And as I said, if you can, the best thing to do is create your own custom theme. The base theme idea is good because it gets you part of the way there, but the problem is that you end up overwriting some of those files that the base theme is doing, and so you're contributing more to the weight of the site by the number of files that that Drupal has to comb through. So beyond those are specifically your coding, like the CSS files, the template files. If you can organize your code by using some of the now best practices like BEM, SMAX, or object-oriented CSS, you're going to not only streamline your code, you're going to make it less redundant, but you're also going to make it a lot easier for you just to find the code. So, you know, when we talk about efficiency and performance, we're also talking about just developer performance and finding the files that you need. Understand specificity, because it will create traps, and if you don't understand it, and if you don't understand that, you will end up adding, you'll be adding extra CSS that you don't need. So one of the best practices you can do is try to avoid going more than 2 elements, or let's say you have a CSS that you're writing that has a couple of classes. Don't go beyond 2 if you can avoid it. Understand selector efficiency is also keeping it in that sort of fashion where there is a hierarchy of selectors, like the IDs and the classes are more efficient than writing to a div, or the worst thing you can do is use an asterisk unless you really, really, really mean it. So the next thing on our list of those 6 ways to improve your performance is to concatenate and minify your code. We want to turn on core CSS and JavaScript aggregation, and probably everybody's doing that already, but it is the first step that you will want to make sure that you do. That will get you a good of the way there, but if you want to do even more of that, use the advanced CSS JavaScript aggregation module. It unfortunately is adding a module, but at the same time it is improving the aggregation that is happening, and it also does a couple of things that are handy, like it will allow you to put JavaScript files to the footer of your page rather than the header. So that improves performance because you are letting all the page CSS and markup load before the JavaScript comes in. A lot of times the JavaScript is used for things like when you click on a button and it spins the logo or something. That's not needed right when the page, immediately after the page loads. It's only when somebody does something. So that's a good reason for putting your JavaScript at the bottom. The modernizer is a way of making your code efficient, because if you don't know what modernizer is, it will check the type of browser that's being used by the user, and it will provide a check of the features that are available to that browser, and will then provide some classes that are in the body tag of the page, and therefore you can write to whether or not that feature is available to you. So you can write around some things, you can provide some backup some fallback methods if the browser isn't able to display something. There is a module that helps make that more efficient because it allows you to, rather than load everything that Modernizer can do, it allows you to cherry pick the features that you want to write to, and it's not going to go through a check of things that you'll never care about. If you're not using the canvas tag, there's no need to check to see whether that browser can display the canvas tag. The Uglify module, Uglify.js module will concatenate and minify JavaScript files. There are some other ways to do these same things, though, that don't involve modules. And in some cases, if you have the time and have an understanding of what you're doing, these are better approaches because you're not adding modules to do something simple. For example, during development, if you're already using Gulp, use something like the Gulp Uglify Gulp plugin to do that for you. It will do those things. It will uglify your files on the fly as you're developing. You can use SVG images instead of JPEG or PNG. Whenever you can, you should do that because those files will be not only smaller typically, but because they're vector, they will always be at the highest resolution regardless of the size that they're being displayed. So any kind of theme files that you like logos or icons, you should be using SVG if you can. Last year in this camp and some other camps, I did a whole presentation on images, and I hit upon SVG quite a bit. And if you want, you can find that presentation on my GitHub page. Software will help you optimize other images. Image Optimum is an example of that. People think oftentimes that if they use Photoshop and they use the save for the web, that they are compressing the image to roughly the smallest, best version that they can. And that's not true. There are methods that will get you a lot smaller image if you use them, and that software is an example. There are many that are out there that will do that. So if you can, obviously you can't do this in content where a content person is uploading an image through the node form. You may not be able to do that if on fast production sites, but anytime you can compress an image better, you should do that. There's also an image optimization that can be done through Gulp that will allow for you, as you're developing the theme files, to you can set a watch so that every time you add a file in a directory, it automatically gets optimized. And I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow in a session that I'm doing at 9 o'clock tomorrow. So the next on our list of ways in which you can become lean is to deliver assets efficiently. We can do that through Drupal in several ways, including using the magic module, which if you're not going to use the CSS advanced CSS and JavaScript aggregation module, this is a good one because it does allow you to put the JavaScript files at the bottom of the page. The picture module is a good way to make sure that you're delivering responsive images efficiently so that you are not, it works with the breakpoints module, and by the way, what it does is in core, So if you're in for 8, so if you're starting to work in Drupal 8, you don't have to worry about installing this picture module. It's already there. But the point being that it will give you the most efficient size image for the browser and the device that is displaying that at the time. If you can, and your site is big enough, if you should try to put some of your assets on a CDN, a content delivery network, that will spread out the distribution of those images to different servers across the world. Or you can specify, like if you have a concentration of your audience on, say, the Pacific Rim, where you could specify CDN sites that are targeted in a specific area. And what that will do is that will allow the assets to be delivered from a location that is closest to where the user is when they're viewing a page. You can also defer loading images by using something like the image lazy loader module. What that does is it's not going to load images until you scroll down close to where that image would start to appear on the page. There's no point in loading an image if it's not going to be seen, and it's only going to be seen if the person scrolls. So that's what lazy loading does. There is also an image API optimized module, which will it will work with the image styles module that is part of core, so that it will improve the optimization of images that are uploaded through the files widget. And there's a sandbox module that I have not tried, but it looks interesting. I'm sorry?
404s now. I pulled up the PDF and it is that link, 404s. It's not there anymore.
Oh. Okay. It should be just on Drupal.org site. So I'm. Oh. Okay. I'll look into that. Thanks for letting me know. I wonder how do you remove a sandbox? Can you? Okay. Maybe it got moved to. Maybe it's now a contrib module now. I'll look into that. Thanks for letting me know. But prefetching and pre-rendering, you can specify certain domains where some of your assets are coming from, so that those calls will be made before they're actually needed. You can, for example, if you know that on the next page you have some big image that needs to be displayed, you can set up through a prefetch. It's actually a meta tag in your code that will get the DNS check already taken care of, so that when it is time to load the page, half the work has already been done. There are some ways to do some of these same things without modules. You can add your own, like I said, you can, those prefetching is just done through a meta tag, so you can actually do that just by adding it to the template file if you want. The advantage of a module might be that it will go through your site and check to see which ones are, which assets are most appropriate for doing something like that. You can also check your Google Analytics for that, though. You can check to see what features are most likely to be, like what pages are going to be clicked on next from the specific page, and so you can add, you can anticipate where somebody will go by adding a prefetch. You can also prefetch web fonts. Domain sharding is another technique where you are adding assets from your site, from your server, but you're using subdomains of your domain to trick the browser into using multiple connections because there is a limit to the number of assets that can be downloaded from a domain. So you use a subdomain to trick the browser into going at a different path for loading some of your assets. You may have seen this where you'll look at the source code and it'll say that some images are coming from image.mydomain.com and some JavaScript is coming from scripts.mydomain.com. And that's exactly what domain sharding is. You can, even though we have been told a long time ago that, or for a long time, that we should have all of our CSS and our JavaScript in these files that we call from from our markup, so that everything is nice and tidy in these files. It turns out that if inline CSS in JavaScript is much faster. So it's harder to maintain, but there are some ways in which you can check out what that first part of the page is that's going to load, or typically load, that concept of above the fold, and put that in line. So put that actually in the markup of your page rather than in the or put it in the header. I mean, but not as a separate file, but embedded right in the page. And there's a node, a module with Gulp that will do exactly that, where it will automate some of that. Well, it will look at the page and it will know where the CSS and JavaScript is needed for, and it will add it to as an inline part of your page. You can also host certain JavaScript libraries and fonts. We talked about that earlier. If you can use a hosted version of that, you are taking some of the load off your server, so it's being loaded from a source that's, in the case of Google, that's a CDN in essence, because they've got servers all over the country. So you are going to get a faster delivery of those assets.
Oh, I got a quick question.
Yes.
So, take Drupal ships with jQuery, and then you write your own, behaviors, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're using something like advanced ag to aggregate and minify and, put all that stuff together. So if you say, well, I'm going to, instead of concatenate and minify my jQuery with the jQuery and the jQuery UI that ships with Drupal, I'm going to add another HTTP request for another domain out there.
Mm-hmm.
Is the advantage of loading something like jQuery from, say, Google, worth the extra HTTP request when maybe you've already got it minified and concatenated?
Yeah, actually, chances are it is. Partly because it could be coming from a location that's closer, and you have other assets that are being loaded from your domain. So if you can kind of offload something to a different domain, to reduce the number of conflicts with that limit to the concurrent connections.
Can I put another wrinkle on there? What if you're already using a CDN like Cloudflare?
Well, at that point, I think that testing is, and that's what we're going to get into, is testing, where you could try it out and see which works better. But to me, it would seem like it'd be kind of apples to apples, kind of, it's going to be very similar. I would presume. So as I said, we're going to talk about budgeting and testing, and this is something that is very, it seems like, how do you do that? Is it necessary? What do you get out of it? Kind of situation. Well, it's not that difficult, and the value is quite high. The budget is essentially just what are your expectations for a load time on this page or on the site, and a number of pages. So what you're doing is you're just selecting a few representative pages on the site, and you're setting a budget for those pages. And then what you do is then you test regularly to make sure that you're still within that budgeted limit. It's a good idea to test your competitor sites, because that's sort of a benchmark that you can easily use to see if you are at least as good or better than your competitor site. We talked earlier about how people don't like to wait around for a web page to load, and if you are providing a page that's faster than your competitor, chances are you have a happier customer, and therefore the customer will come back to you before they'll go back to the competitor's site. And then finally, the budget allows you to make decisions on what parts of the page are really important and what parts maybe you don't really need, or how do I do something that if it's less performant, should I be doing that or not? So we might want to decide we have to optimize all of our images, because we're not going to be able to make our budget without. Or we may decide, that idea was good, that long list of whatever it was, or this nice big fat image was a nice idea, or that animation was cool, but is it really needed? Does it really help our traffic? Does it really help our goals of the message that we have, or does it help sell our product? Can we just not add that feature right now because it's going to break the budget? There are 4 different ways in which you can set a budget, and it's not so important that you know each one of these, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of the methods. I've actually seen other lists that had different methods, but this gives you a kind of an idea of how you would set budgets. One is called milestone timings, speed index, quality-based metrics, rule-based metrics. The milestone timings budget method is really the simplest. It's just figuring out how long does it take to render a page. And this is an example taking from, if I remember right, that was Google Chrome Developer, where you are, it just says it took 3.33 seconds to load that page, to render that page. Now that's good information, and there's nothing wrong with it, except that it's the whole page, and the visitor probably isn't going to, as you know, that most pages there's that so-called fold, and so there's lots of content that you only get to after you scroll to it. So, but this measurement is taking all that page into consideration. But it's an easy one to get that number, and it's a pretty easy one to keep track of. Speed index is another method. This is using the speed index. I can't. is that, I'm sorry? Yes. And the speed index is a little bit more useful because it takes into consideration the size of the viewport, and it measures just what the user is actually going to see within that viewport. And webpagetest.org is a good place to get that speed index number. The quantity-based metrics is just a simple count of the number of requests. Kind of like the amount of time it takes for a page to render. It's a good number to look at, but it may not tell you the whole picture. But it's something to kind of make that if you want to use that as a budget metric, it's one that's easy to track during development. And unfortunately, it just doesn't tell you anything about the user experience. This particular method I've used here to show the quantity of assets is with YSlow. And I like that particular method for looking at that because it's a real clear method of displaying that information. The rule-based metrics is more of a checklist, and there are a couple of methods that you can do that. It's essentially it's not a amount of time, it's more of a score. So like, for example, you can see 61 out of 100 is the score that Page Speed Insights will provide you. YSlow will do something similar where it's giving you, in fact, YSlow gives you a letter grade, and there's like 5 or 6 or 7 different letter grades that YSlow will give you. The nice thing is that you can look up most of these things not only on your own site but your competitor's site. So you can, and if you say, okay, we always want to be above 70 on that speed score, we can. It's easy to check on individual pages. If you do all these things, you're going to have happy users, you're going to have happy developers, you're going to have happy sysadmins. Everything is good. So thank you very much. I am ready for some questions. Yes?
What would you say is the single thing that you can do for the most performance improvement with regard to authenticated users as opposed to anonymous who benefit from more caching?
Okay. Well, I think that the point being that it's hard to say based on your content and your users and the purpose of your site is going to. So it's kind of hard to give a quick brush stroke answer to that. But I would say optimizing images is a, especially, unless you don't have hardly any images, I would say make sure that all of your images are as optimized as possible. And secondly, making sure that everything that you can aggregate and minify, you've done that. Yes?
Total number of modules that you have enabled on the website, how much it impacts the website performance?
I don't know that you can specifically quantify that, especially since there are modules and then there are modules. Views is a huge module, and then there's some that don't. And then there's some that are able to be more efficient, or they are only employed for a certain purpose and they get out of the way when they're not needed. But so I don't. I've not done any particular research to see if there's a magic number of modules, but again, I think that goes back to every site is different. Yes, James.
Actually, going along those lines with the modules and trying to minify the number of modules you have installed. When it comes to building custom modules, are you on the camp that you build all of what you're doing into one module, like the general custom module for this project, or do you split it out into multiple modules to make it categorized and make sense?
I think that gets more into, if it were me, I think I would be more concerned about what is easy to maintain, what is easy to troubleshoot when there's a problem. If you have one module that tries to do it all, you could be creating problems not only for you, but keep in mind that other developers may be taking over the site, and you want to make sure that you leave a clean as path as you can to troubleshoot.
Yes.
So if you have a CAPTCHA module or like Mulum or something on there, and that disables page caching for whatever page that form is loaded on, is there a way around that, a way you can implement caching for objects on the page that, other than the actual CAPTCHA itself?
Yeah, block caching should cache individual blocks, shouldn't they?
So I'm trying to remember exactly what the screen looks like, but it seems to me a lot of times the block caching seems disabled. So and then it'll say page caching not available for, like, it's grayed out.
If you're using anything that grants node permissions, then block caching typically gets disabled.
Okay, so like
Because
access
the
control
access
stuff.
to the content of the block, it depends on whether you have permission to do that node.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So if you're using a lot of forms, publicly visible forms, like lead capture forms on pages, you could actually totally ruin your Drupal caching.
Yeah, unless you're going the route of varnish, which it's been a long time since I've worked on a site that wasn't varnished, so it'll still ruin your varnish caching. Well,
So memcache, varnish, all that's basically a waste if you've got CAPTCHAs.
Memcache will still benefit,
Memcache will,
because you'll still get the PHP objects
Yeah.
cache, but your front-side caches are tough.
So CDN is basically your only chance left.
You can try cache tags where you can tag the particular thing using tag, not using it full.
Okay.
Try cache tags, that work actually, we tried it.
Cache tags on
One of the
assets.
sites we have is having a lot of access controls. That's exactly what it is. If you did it for the page caching and block caching,
Yeah.
it's disable it. Automatically work it out.
Okay. So cache.
you